The Theory of the Leisure Class by Thorstein Veblen, Chapter 2, Pecuniary Emulation. In the sequence of cultural evolution, the emergence of a leisure class coincides with the beginning of ownership. This is necessarily the case, for these two institutions result from the same set of economic forces. In the inchoate phase of their development, they are but different aspects of the same general facts of social structure. It is as elements of social structure, conventional facts, that leisure and ownership are matters of interest for the purpose in hand. An habitual neglect of work does not constitute a leisure class, neither does the mechanical fact of use and consumption constitute ownership. The present inquiry, therefore, is not concerned with the beginning of indolence, nor with the beginning of the appropriation of useful articles to individual consumption. The point in question is the origin and nature of a conventional leisure class on the one hand, and the beginnings of individual ownership as a conventional right of equitable claim on the other hand. The early differentiation out of which the distinction between a leisure and a working class arises in the division maintained between men's and women's work in the lower stages of barbarism. Likewise, the earliest form of ownership is an ownership of the women by the able-bodied men of the community. The facts may be expressed in more general terms and truer to the import of the barbarian theory of life by saying that it is an ownership of the woman by the man. There was undoubtedly some appropriation of useful articles before the custom of appropriating women arose. The usage of existing archaic communities in which there is no ownership of women is warrant for such a view. In all communities, the members, both male and female, habitually appropriate to their individual use a variety of useful things, but these useful things are not thought of as owned by the person who appropriates and consumes them. The habitual appropriation and consumption of certain slight personal effects goes on without raising the question of ownership, that is to say, the question of a conventional equitable claim to extraneous things. The ownership of women begins in the lower barbarian stages of culture, apparently with the seizure of female captives. The original reason for the seizure and appropriation of women seems to have been their usefulness as trophies. The practice of seizing women from the enemy as trophies gave rise to a form of ownership marriage resulting in a household with a male head. This was followed by an extension of slavery to other captives and inferiors besides women, and by an extension of ownership marriage to other women than those seized by the enemy. The outcome of emulation under the circumstances of a predatory life, therefore, has been on the one hand a form of marriage resting on coercion, and on the other hand the custom of ownership. The two institutions are not distinguishable in the initial phase of their development. Both arise from the desire of the successful men to put their prowess in evidence by exhibiting some durable result of their exploits. Both also minister to that propensity for mastery which pervades all predatory communities. From the ownership of women, the concept of ownership extends itself to include the products of their industry, and so there arises the ownership of things as well as of persons. In this way, a consistent system of property and goods is gradually installed, and although in the latest stages of the development, the serviceability of goods for consumption has come to be the most obtrusive element of their value, still wealth has by no means yet lost its utility as an honorific evidence of the owner's prepotence. Whenever the institution of private property is found, even in a slightly developed form, the economic process bears the character of a struggle between men for the possession of goods. It has been customary in economic theory, and especially among those economists who adhere with least faltering to the body of modernized classical doctrines, to constitute this struggle for wealth as being substantially a struggle for subsistence. Such is, no doubt, its character in large part during the earlier and less efficient phases of industry. Such is also its character in all cases where the niggardliness of nature is so strict as to afford but a scanty livelihood to the community in return for strenuous and unremitting application to the business of getting the means of subsistence. But in all progressing communities, an advance is presently made beyond the early stage of technological development. Industrial efficiency is presently carried to such a pitch as to afford something appreciably more than a bare livelihood to those engaged in the industrial process. It has not yet been unusual for economic theory to speak of the further struggle for wealth on this new industrial basis as a competition for an increase of the comforts of life, primarily for an increase of the physical comforts which the consumption of goods affords. The end of acquisition and accumulation is conventionally held to be the consumption of the goods accumulated, whether it is consumption directly by the owner of the goods or by the household attached to him, and for this purpose identified with him in theory. This is at least felt to be the economically legitimate end of acquisition, which alone it is incumbent on the theory to take account of. Such consumption may of course be conceived to serve the consumer's physical wants, his physical comfort, or his so-called higher wants, spiritual, aesthetic, intellectual, or whatnot. The latter class of wants being served indirectly by an expenditure of goods after the fashion familiar to all economic readers. But it is only when taken in a sense far removed from its naive meaning that the consumption of goods can be said to afford the incentive from which accumulation invariably proceeds. The motive that lies at the root of ownership is emulation, and the same motive of emulation continues active in the further development of the institution to which it has given rise, in the development of all those features of the social structure which the institution of ownership touches. The possession of wealth confers honor. It is an invidious distinction. Nothing equally cogent can be said for the consumption of goods, nor for any other conceivable incentive to acquisition, and especially not for any incentive to the accumulation of wealth. It is of course not to be overlooked that in a community where nearly all goods are private property, the necessity of earning a livelihood is a powerful and ever-present incentive for the poorer members of the community. The need of subsistence and of an increase of physical comfort may for a time be the dominant motive of acquisition for these classes who are habitually employed at manual labor, whose subsistence is on a precarious footing, who possesses little and ordinarily accumulate little. But it will appear in the course of the discussion that even in the case of these impecunious classes, the predominance of the motive of physical want is not so decided as has sometimes been assumed. On the other hand, so far as regards those members and classes of the community who are chiefly concerned in the accumulation of wealth, the incentive of subsistence or of physical comfort never plays a considerable part. Ownership began and grew into a human institution on grounds unrelated to the subsistence minimum. The dominant incentive was from the outset the invidious distinction attaching to wealth, and save temporarily and by exception no other motive has usurped the primacy at any later stage of the development. Property set out with being booty held as trophies of the successful raid. So long as the group had departed but little from the primitive communal organization, and so long as it still stood in close contact with other hostile groups, the utility of things or persons owned lay chiefly in an invidious comparison between their possessor and the enemy from whom they were taken. The habit of distinguishing between the interests of the individual and those of the group to which he belongs is apparently a latter growth. Invidious comparison between the possessor of the honorific booty and his less successful neighbors within the group was no doubt present early as an element of the utility of the things possessed, though this was not at the outset the chief element of their value. The man's prowess was still primarily the group's prowess, and the possessor of the booty felt himself to be primarily the keeper of the honor of his group. This appreciation of exploit from the communal point of view is met with also at later stages of social growth, especially as regard by the laurels of war. But so soon as the custom of individual ownership begins to gain constancy, the point of view taken in making the invidious comparison on which private property rests will begin to change. Indeed, the one change is but the reflex of the other. The initial phase of ownership, the phase of acquisition by naive seizure and conversion, begins to pass into the subsequent stage of an incipient organization of industry on the basis of private property in slaves. The horde develops into a more or less self-sufficing industrial community. Possessions then become to be valued not so much as evidence of successful foray, but rather as evidence of the prepotence of the possessor of these goods over other individuals within the community. The invidious comparison now becomes primarily a comparison of the owner with the other members of the group. Property is still of the nature of trophy, but with the cultural advance it becomes more and more a trophy of successes scored in the game of ownership carried on between the members of the group under the quasi-peaceable methods of nomadic life. Gradually, as industrial activity further displaces predatory activity in the community's everyday life and in men's habits of thought, accumulated property more and more replaces trophies of predatory exploit as the conventional exponent of prepotence and success. With the growth of settled industry, therefore, the possession of wealth gains in relative importance and effectiveness as a customary basis of repute and esteem. Not that esteem ceases to be awarded on the basis of other, more direct evidence of prowess, not that successful predatory aggression or warlike exploit ceases to call out the approval and admiration of the crowd or to stir the envy of the less successful competitors, but the opportunities for gaining distinction by means of this direct manifestation of superior force grow less available both in scope and frequency. At the same time, opportunities for industrial aggression and for the accumulation of property by the quasi-peaceable methods of nomadic industry increase in scope and availability. And it is even more to the point that property now becomes the most easily recognized evidence of a reputable degree of success as distinguished from heroic or signal achievement. It therefore becomes the conventional basis of esteem. Its possession in some amount becomes necessary in order to obscure or possess any reputable standing in the community. It becomes indispensable to accumulate, to acquire, in order to retain one's good name. When accumulated goods have in this way once become the accepted badge of efficiency, the possession of wealth presently assumes the character of an independent and definitive basis of esteem. The possession of goods, whether acquired aggressively by one's own exertion or passively by transmission through inheritance from others, becomes a conventional basis of reputability. The possession of wealth, which was at the outset valued simply as an evidence of efficiency, becomes in popular apprehension itself a meritorious act. Wealth is now itself intrinsically honorable and confers honor on its possessor. By a further refinement, wealth acquired passively by transmission from ancestors or other antecedents presently becomes even more honorific than wealth acquired by the possessor's own effort. But this distinction belongs at a latter stage in the evolution of the pecuniary culture and will be spoken of in its place. Prowess and exploit may still remain in the basis of award of the highest popular esteem, although the possession of wealth has become the basis of commonplace reputability and of a blameless social standing. The predatory instinct and the consequent approbation of predatory efficiency are deeply ingrained in the habits of thought of those people who have passed under the discipline of a protracted predatory culture. According to popular award, the highest honors within human reach may even yet be those gained by an unfolding of extraordinary predatory efficiency in war or by a quasi-predatory efficiency in statecraft. But for the purposes of a commonplace decent standing in the community, these means of repute have been replaced by the acquisition and accumulation of goods. In order to stand well in the eyes of the community, it is necessary to come up to a certain, somewhat indefinite, conventional standard of wealth. Just as in this earlier predatory stage, it is necessary for the barbarian man to come up to the tribe standard of physical endurance, cunning, and skill at arms. A certain standard of wealth in the one case and of prowess in the other is a necessary condition of reputability, and anything in excess of this normal amount is meritorious. Those members of the community who fall short of this somewhat indefinite normal degree of prowess or of property suffer in the esteem of their fellow man, and consequently they suffer also in their own esteem, since the usual basis of self-respect is the respect accorded by one's neighbors. Only individuals with an aberrant temperament can in the long run retain their self-esteem in the face of the disesteem of their fellows. Apparent exceptions to the rule are met with, especially among people with strong religious convictions. But these apparent exceptions are scarcely real exceptions, since such persons commonly fall back on the putative approbation of some supernatural witness of their deeds. So soon as the possession of property becomes the basis of popular esteem, therefore it becomes also a requisite to the complacency which we call self-respect. In any community where goods are held in severalty, it is necessary in order to his own peace of mind that an individual should possess as large a portion of goods as others with whom he is accustomed to class himself, and it is extremely gratifying to possess something more than others. But as fast as a person makes new acquisitions and becomes accustomed to the resulting new standard of wealth, the new standard forthwith ceases to afford appreciably greater satisfaction than the earlier standard did. The tendency in any case is constantly to make the present pecuniary standard the point of departure for a fresh increase of wealth, and this in turn gives rise to a new standard of sufficiency and a new pecuniary classification of one's self as compared with one's neighbors. So far as concerns the present question, the end sought by accumulation is to rank high in comparison with the rest of the community in point of pecuniary strength. So long as the comparison is distinctly unfavorable to himself, the normal average individual will live in chronic dissatisfaction with his present lot. And when he has reached what may be called the normal pecuniary standard of the community or of his class in the community, this chronic dissatisfaction will give place to a restless straining to place a wider and ever-widening pecuniary interval between himself and this average standard. The invidious comparison can never become so favorable to the individual making it that he would not gladly rate himself still higher relatively to his competitors in the struggle for pecuniary reputability. In the nature of the case, the desire for wealth can scarcely be satiated in any individual instance, and evidently a satiation of the average or general desire for wealth is not out of the question. However widely or equally or fairly it may be distributed, no general increase of the community's wealth can make any approach to satiating this need, the ground of which is the desire of everyone to excel everyone else in their accumulation of goods. If, as is sometimes assumed, the incentive to accumulation were the want of subsistence or of physical comfort, then the aggregate economic wants of the community might conceivably be satisfied at some point in the advance of industrial efficiency. But since the struggle is substantially a race for reputability on the basis of an invidious comparison, no approach to a definitive attainment is possible. What has just been said must not be taken to mean that there are no other incentives to acquisition and accumulation than this desire to excel in pecuniary standing and so gain the esteem and envy of one's fellow men. The desire for added comfort and security from want is present as a motive at every stage of the process of accumulation in a modern industrial community, although the standard of sufficiency in these respects is in turn greatly affected by the habit of pecuniary emulation. To a great extent, this emulation shapes the methods and selects the objects of expenditure for personal comfort and decent livelihood. Besides this, the power conferred by wealth also affords a motive to accumulation. That propensity for purposeful activity and the repugnance to all futility of effort which belong to a man by virtue of his character as an agent do not desert him when he emerges from the naive communal culture where the dominant note of life is the unanalyzed and undifferentiated solidarity of the individual with the group with which his life is bound up. When he enters upon the predatory stage, where self-seeking in the narrower sense becomes the dominant note, this propensity goes with him still as the pervasive trait that shapes his scheme of life. The propensity for achievement and the repugnance to futility remain the underlying economic motive. The propensity changes only in the form of its expression and in the proximate objects to which it directs the man's activity. Under the regime of individual ownership, the most available means of visibly achieving a purpose is that afforded by the acquisition and accumulation of goods, and as the self-regarding antithesis between man and man reaches fuller consciousness, the propensity for achievement, the instinct of workmanship, tends more and more to shape itself into a straining to excel others in pecuniary achievement. Relative success, tested by an invidious pecuniary comparison with other men, becomes the conventional end of action. The currently accepted legitimate end of effort becomes the achievement of a favorable comparison with other men, and therefore the repugnance to futility to a good extent coalesces with the incentive of emulation. It acts to accentuate the struggle for pecuniary reputability by visiting with a sharper disapproval all shortcomings and all evidence of shortcoming in point of pecuniary success. Purposeful effort comes to mean primarily effort directed to or resulting in a more credible showing of accumulated wealth. Among the motives which lead men to accumulate wealth, the primacy both in scope and intensity therefore continues to belong to this motive of pecuniary emulation. In making use of the term invidious, it may perhaps be unnecessary to remark there is no intention to extol or depreciate or to commend or deplore any of this phenomena which the word is used to characterize. The term is used in a technical sense as describing a comparison of persons with a view to rating and grading them in respect to relative worth or value, in an aesthetic or moral sense, and so rewarding and defining their relative degrees of complacency with which they may legitimately be contemplated by themselves and by others. An invidious comparison is a process of valuation of persons in respect of worth.